personal history. There was a time when my name was in the newspapers and I was on television and all of those kinds of things, and of course it had to do with the trial, which I'll talk about presently. But of course now years have gone by. It's been 13 years or so since I was arrested. In 1972 I was acquitted. I was found not guilty. And many of you, I imagine, were quite young 13 years ago. Some of you, at least. Yeah. Well, not very long ago in one of my classes, the students, at the beginning of each semester, I generally ask the students to say something about themselves and why they are taking a particular course. And of course, some of the students generally say that they want to take a course because they want to take that particular course because I'm teaching them. And they wanted to make sure they took a course with me before they graduated. And there was this one student who, towards the end of these discussions, finally looked at me and said, "Just who are you?" And so I said, well, I imagine that a number of the students in the class know who I am because I spent some time in jail. You spent some time in jail? Well, in any event, in 1969, as a matter of fact, I had been accepted as a member of the faculty at UCLA, the philosophy department. And before I had the opportunity to teach my first class, I learned that I had been fired by the Board of Regents, on which the governor sat as an ex officio member, the governor at that time, of course, being Ronald Reagan. I was fired from my position at UCLA because I was a member of the Communist Party. At that time, I pointed out that it was because I was a communist, but it was also because I was black, and it was also because I was a woman. And during the year 1969, 1970, I did teach as a result of receiving an injunction prohibiting the regents from firing me pending the outcome of the case in the higher courts. But at the same time, I recognized that it was important not only for me to defend my right to teach, but it was also important to draw the connections between what was happening on the campus and what was happening in the community, what was happening in the streets and what was happening in the jails and the prisons. At that particular time, of course, the Black Panther Party all over the country was under attack. J. Edgar Hoover, who headed the FBI at that time, had conspired with numerous chiefs of police in major cities across the country, literally to destroy the Black Panther Party. And so there were violent assaults on their offices. Right here in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles SWAT team, the National Guard attacked the Black Panther Party office because, as they put it, they had a warrant for a person whom they believed to be a member of the Black Panther Party, and this person had been charged with disturbing the peace. Well, they went with helicopters and dynamite and tear gas and machine guns and everything imaginable. And the SWAT squad, those men were involved in their first active assault in this country, most of them having gotten their experience in Vietnam as Green Berets. That is what that period was like. And so it became very important for me to link up what was happening to me, the political repression which I was suffering with what was happening in the larger community. There was a case involving George Jackson, John Cliche, Frida Drumgo, who had been charged in Soledad prison with having killed a guard. They had been fraudulently charged with murder. And had they been convicted, they would have been sentenced to death. I felt that it was extremely important to, again, establish the connection between the repression of which I was a victim on the campus and the repression which the Soledad brothers were suffering in prison. Of course, I only risked the possibility of losing my job. They risked the possibility of losing their lives. At the same time, at UCLA, if any of you remember that era, you will recall that it was extremely violent. I personally received numerous threats, day after day, week after week. As a matter of fact, the campus security generally accompanied me to start my car. One of the police officers would get into the car and start, and the other would stand behind a cement pillar, which I learned to do as well. There would be days when I would be delivering a lecture and one of the campus cops would enter the lecture hall and would call me aside and say that they had just learned that threats on my life had been made, perhaps on the campus, perhaps other parts of Los Angeles, and that they were going to accompany me until I left the campus. But they provided very good security for me while I was on the campus. They wanted to make sure that I didn't get killed on UCLA's campus, you see. But I had to arrange for my own security once I stepped off of the campus. And therefore I did purchase a number of weapons, which were used by various individuals who did security for me during that period. Well, of course, several of those weapons were later used by Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson's brother. Jonathan was very much involved in the struggle between his brother and the two other Soledad brothers. He was very young. He was 16 years old when he became involved in that business. He had hoped to see his brother free for some 10 years, since he had been 6 years old or so, and had never seen him since the age of 6 outside of prison walls. Had never seen him when he wasn't chained or watched over by an armed guard. Of course, on August 7th, 1970, there was what has come to be called the Marin County Prisoner Rebellion. Jonathan was killed. Other prisoners were killed. And because weapons that were registered in my name were used, I was charged with murder, kidnapping, and guilt. I went underground. Eventually was arrested. Eventually stood trial. In the meantime, a vast movement developed. As a result of that movement, finally, in the summer of 1972, I was acquitted. It was at that time that we established an organization which we felt was extremely needed at that time, because although the victory of my acquittal was important, there were many, many other political prisoners. There were many, many other manifestations of racist and political repression. Therefore, we established the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression. And this is the organization I represented today. is a difficult period. If we talk about the past, we talk about the past decade, we talk about the past century, and we talk about the past 2 centuries, it seems to me that what we ought to seek in discussing Black history are lessons on how to struggle today. This is a very difficult period. We've seen the erosion of victories that have been won over the years by people struggling against racism, against economic injustices, against male supremacy. The impact of the Reagan administration has been devastating. It has been devastating for working people. It has been devastating for women. It has been devastating for Black people and Chicanos and Puerto Ricans and Native American Indians and Asians. It has been devastating for youth. It has been devastating for the disabled. It has been devastating for gays and lesbians. It has been devastating for virtually every oppressed group in this society. And I think that if we have any immediate goal, if there is an urgent goal, which we all ought to seek to achieve during this period, that is the defeat of Ronald Reagan and his administration. Now, as you've heard, this is Black History Month. It seems to me that the time ought to eventually come when we don't have to set aside 1 month to talk about Black history. But this is a time, indeed, when we should reflect on the struggles and the contributions of Afro-Americans, not simply for the sake of acquiring knowledge about Black people, although this is extremely important because given the racism in our educational system, most people in this country do not have the opportunity to learn about the contributions and the struggles of Black people. But we should also take some time to reflect on those contributions and those struggles because this information can assist us in our battles today. And it is not only important for Black people and other people of color to understand and to grasp the meaning of the historical struggles waged by Black people. It is important for white people as well. As a matter of fact, I think that if you examine the history of Black people in this country, you will see that each time Black people have won victories, this has meant the extension of rights and liberties for the vast majority of the population of this country. This has meant the extension of democratic rights and liberties for the masses of white people as well. And I say this because we're oftentimes misled by this notion that when Black people benefit, that means that white people are going to have to suffer. This mythological pie that we always hear about, and there are only so many slices in it. So if Black people get a bigger slice of the pie, that means that that must come from the slice that white people were already enjoying. But of course, in actuality, each time Black people win a victory, the whole pie is enlarged. And we should understand that because the efforts to successful, unfortunately, to a certain extent, to convince the majority of people in this country that affirmative action does not benefit the masses of people. It benefits only black people or only racially oppressed people, or indeed only women as opposed to men. But that's not the case. That is not the case. And I think we all have to develop the kinds of arguments that are persuasive so that we are able to convince others that the fight against racism is a fight that all progressive people in this country should be waging, regardless of what their racial background might be. I want to talk a little bit about racism in education. But before I speak about some of the contemporary manifestations of racism, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the struggle for knowledge among black people. And this is something that historically has been very sacred. As a matter of fact, in many ways, the struggle for Afro-American liberation has been synonymous with the struggle for knowledge, the struggle for education. When you consider that slaves were prohibited from learning how to read and write, and were often, as a matter of fact, executed if it were found out that they had learned how to read the Bible or had learned how to write. And of course, writing was very important for slaves. Because if you knew how to write, you could write out your own tests. And of course, no slave had the right to be off a plantation or off the farm unless he or she possessed a permit written out by the master. And since it was assumed that the slaves could not read or write, if a black person who was obviously a slave held a piece of paper saying that they had the right to be off the plantation at that particular time, that might serve, of course, as a means of following the Underground Railroad to freedom. Black people sacrificed a great deal to be able to learn how to read. As a matter of fact, there were often night schools run by black women. And if you know what the workday was like for slaves from sun up to sundown, or from can't see in the morning to can't see no more at night, especially during the cotton harvest. And when you consider that many people, after they had put in this hard day's work, would return to the quarters, and after the master and his family had gone to sleep, would get up and spend several hours studying. There were midnight schools. And can you imagine going to sleep at 2 or 3 in the morning and then waking up again at 5 to go out into the field? And I mention this because all too often the kinds of justifications that have been given for the lack of facilities, for the lack of educational facilities for black people have rested on the notion that black people really don't want to get an education anyway. Or else if we want to, not capable of being educated. As the William Shockley or Arthur Jensen might say. And even if we are exposed, we are not genetically capable of learning what white people are genetically capable of learning. Now, Frederick Douglass disputed that notion, if anyone ever disputed it. Frederick Douglass was in the process of learning how to read when he was quite young. His master's wife began to teach him how to read, as she taught her own son. She was from the North, however, and had not really been schooled in the ways of the slavocracy. And when her husband taught her, teaching Frederick Douglass how to read and write, he admonished her severely and said, for example, if you give a black person, he didn't say black person, he used a derogatory term in use for a black person. He said, if you give a black person an itch, you'll take an L. And he said, and besides, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. And Frederick Douglass heard that statement, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. And as he said in his autobiography, he knew exactly what he had to begin to do in order to make his way in the direction of liberation. He began to learn how to read and write by hook and by crook. It meant that he would have to play tricks with the little white boys in order to convince them to show him what this word meant or how to spell that word. He did that. And he not only managed to learn how to read and write, but he developed into one of this country's greatest writers, and certainly one of its most outstanding orators and most effective abolitionists. Of course, in the aftermath of slavery, black people demanded the right to an education, finally. If emancipation meant anything, and of course, emancipation really wasn't about freedom at all. And we all know that Abraham Lincoln didn't really want to free the slaves, don't we? Don't we? He is the great liberator, of course, and his statue sits in Washington, high up. But of course, Abraham Lincoln pointed out that himself on several occasions that if it were possible to save the Union without freeing the slaves, he would do that. And as a matter of fact, Karl Marx had written Abraham Lincoln numerous times from the beginning of the outbreak of the Civil War and had encouraged him to abolish slavery, pointing out that this really was the only way to ensure a Union victory. Abraham Lincoln did not listen at first, and it was only later when it became clear that a Union victory was absolutely contingent on black people fighting. Because if black people fought, they were fighting for their freedom. And black men and women alike fought in the Union Army. You may know that Harriet Tubman became and remains the only woman in the history of this country ever to have led troops in battle. And even after that, they refused to give her a pension. She fought for years and years to get a soldier's pension. Finally, she refused it. But of course, when the Emancipation Proclamation was pronounced, and the masses of slaves were allowed to leave the plantations, one of the very first things they did, even before the war had come to an end, was to appeal to Washington, appeal to Congress to send teachers so that they could begin to learn how to read and write. And finally, of course, when the Freedmen's Bureau was set up, the most outstanding contribution was the Freedmen's Bureau, the creation of schools. And many of the teachers who were down from the North were absolutely astounded by the tenacity with which black people set out to acquire knowledge. By their perseverance. And they described 70, 80-year-old black people spending hours trying to decipher a few words in rough spelling. Or spending hours trying to learn how to write their name. And it was said by many of the teachers that in the areas where they were teaching, although the housing that the former slaves lived in often did not involve even having a wooden floor. Often the floor was dirt, there were no beds, no chairs, no furniture at all. But it was said that if you found nothing else in one of these shacks, you would always find a book. You would find Webster's Speller, or you would find the Bible. And that whole effort to begin to establish a system which would allow black people finally to gain some knowledge was described by W.E.B. Du Bois as one of the most marvelous occurrences in the history of humankind. And what is important about that is not only that black people finally acquired the right to gain some knowledge, but that in the process, the masses of white people in the South acquired that right as well. Because you see, before the Civil War, during slavery times, only the wealthy were able to go to school. Only the sons and daughters of the slaveholders, only those who could afford to pay for it. Finally, when the public school system was set up as a result of the demand that black people made for education, poor white people also were finally able to send their children to school. And I give you this as one example of the extent to which white people in this country have benefited from the gains that Afro-Americans have achieved. Now, of course, those victories which came during the period of radical Reconstruction did not last very long. And that period is really fascinating. It is some of the most progressive legislation that was passed during that period. Not only for black people, but for women. Divorce laws, for example. Not only laws against racism, but laws against anti-Semitism as well. Check out your history. Of course, you have to go a little bit further than the text you usually get in high school or college, because in those texts, they usually say something about the carpetbaggers and the scalawags, and then they leave it at that, right? And you're left with this impression that during the 1870s, you had a bunch of inept black politicians who didn't know what they were doing, and, finally, well, if you went to school in the South like I did, you were informed that finally forces such as the Ku Klux Klan were able to re-establish the rule of civilization in the South. And when I went to school in Birmingham, Alabama, I went to segregated schools. The legacy of that period following Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, when Jim Crow was established as an institution, when black people were disfranchised, when lynchings began to occur at an incredible rate, thousands and thousands of lynchings during that period. I went to school in Birmingham, Alabama. I went to school to elementary school in the little shack. There were two little shacks. And they all had wood stoves, coal stoves, hot stoves, unpainted floors. We had virtually no facilities. We had no recreational facilities at all. We had a place that we called the Bowl to play in, which was a sort of a hollowed-out area with red clay. And we had books that had been cast away by the white students. The books that contained the same racist ideology. And if I had believed my history books, I would have looked at the Civil War as the war for Southern independence and would have believed that when slavery was abolished, this was the worst thing that black people had expected or wanted. Because as my textbook said, now these 4 million black people would have to worry about a job, and they would have to worry about finding some place to stay, and all of the other things that they didn't have to worry about at all as long as they were slaves.